Hello. A few weeks ago, a film trailer made the rounds on the internet for a upcoming, well, now released psychological horror movie called The Carpenter's Son, which is very loosely based off of the life of a young Jesus Christ as attested to in the apocryphal Infancy Gospel of Thomas. The film is basically about a young Jesus Christ coming into his own for the first time, coming to terms with his powers, but not quite knowing yet that he's the Son of God, while various demonic forces are tempting and tormenting him. Meanwhile, his parents, played by my guy Nicolas Cage and the actress formerly known as Twigs, they don't really know what to do with this surly teenager who is lashing out in various ways. The usual suspects, which is to say internet evangelicals, did not take it very well. Every single trailer, they'd leave hundreds of comments like, "Look at Hollywood mocking God. Nicolas Cage deserves a place in hell for engaging in this heretical filth." However, I thought it had potential. A, I am a lifelong fan of Nicolas Cage, and B, I am something of an amateur religious scholar because I think religion is just as important as history, philosophy, literature, etc. for understanding the human condition, even though I do not claim to be Christian. I saw the movie last night, opening night. I was the only person there, and the theater I saw it at was the only theater showing it in the entire state, so that's a good sign for its box office legs. But before I get into my experience with the movie itself, I want to briefly discuss the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Most of what we consider today to be the New Testament was written in the late first century, probably around or after the destruction of the Second Temple of Jerusalem. You have Gospels, you have epistles, you have the Apocalypse of John, also known as the Book of Revelation, etc. What a lot of people, even religious people, don't realize is that the modern canon of the Bible is something of a crapshoot. Dozens and dozens of gospels and other books were written in the first and second centuries by people who wanted to explore the idea of Jesus Christ. Let's put it that way. They were written by Jews, Greeks, Gnostics, all of these different factions who brought their own opinions and interpretations to the life of Jesus Christ. And then several hundred years after those books were written, the Catholic Church organized the Council of Hippo, where they said, okay, these are the 27 books that we like the most. This is going to be our canon. This is going to be our New Testament. And that is generally the canon that Christians have stuck with to the modern day. However, there's so many other books that could have made the cut, that could have become scripture, that semi-arbitrarily did not. And one of those books is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which professes to be about the life of a young Jesus Christ, roughly between the ages of 5 and 12. It's not a very long read, so I recommend that you do it. There are some real moments of beauty in it. I think most notably the opening story where Christ makes 12 sparrows out of clay and then he brings them to life with a clap. I found that very charming. Interestingly enough, that is a story that is corroborated by the Quran. In the 5th surah of the Quran, Allah literally says, hey, remember that time Christ made clay pigeons and brought them to life? Which really tickles me because a lot of people are very quick to dismiss the Infancy Gospel of Thomas as fan fiction, and yet that is one of the few works that gets backed up by other scripture sets around the world. The reason why the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is so infamous is because the young Christ as portrayed in that gospel is kind of psychotic. He is sort of a petulant kid who, for lack of a better term, keeps doing murders. Like a kid stomps on some pawns that he's playing with and he's like, why did you remove the life of my pawns? I'll remove your life, and then kills the kid on the spot. And then everyone runs to Joseph and is like, hey, your kid just killed our kid with wizard powers. And Joseph just puts his head in his hands. Ugh. I do want to disclaim that even though this child Christ keeps killing people, he ultimately does bring them all back to life. So no harm, no foul, right? I would say 2/3 of the infancy gospel is these various miracles and curses back and forth. But the other third is these anecdotes of the long-suffering Joseph trying to get Christ educated in his letters and whatnot. You know, he's bringing him to various teachers and saying, hey, you need to go to school, learn your Hebrew letters from him, learn how to read the Torah, etc. Except this young Jesus is so obsessed with intellectually owning the teachers that he never really gets any education done. So you just have the teachers saying like, I tried to teach your son. I tried to teach him the letter alpha. Young Jesus says in this comedically eloquent way, who are you to teach me alpha if you do not understand beta in all the other ways of the universe? The person who wrote the infancy gospel was clearly inspired by the famous anecdote from, I think it's Luke, where Christ and his family goes to the temple and then 12-year-old Christ is seen educating the rabbis in the Torah. This story that's meant to demonstrate that Christ was wise in the ways of religion, even as a youth. I think that is a charming story for a 12-year-old. But when this 5-year-old speaking like an adult just terrorizes not only his teachers, but the people around him, it really reminds me of some of those Christian copy pastas where newborn babies will yell at doctors about abortion or whatever. No weapon fashioned against me shall prosper. I think the most interesting through line of the infancy gospel, which clearly inspired this movie the most, is just the constant exasperation that Mary and Joseph have with their son, because they understand that he is from God in some capacity, but nevertheless, he keeps making mischief intentionally or not. The reason why I wanted to talk about the infancy gospel first up is kind of a defense. It's not very well written. You can tell that they left it out of the main canon for a reason. But nevertheless, it was a deeply popular book, despite being dismissed by the early church fathers. Unlike a lot of apocryphal books, which were thoroughly stamped out, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas was copied and recopied and translated throughout Europe well into the late Middle Ages. For example, it was turned into a beautiful Irish poem around the year 700, very shortly after Ireland was initially Christianized, I believe. So it's very easy to look at it and say, look at this stupid book where baby Jesus keeps murdering people. But I invite people to think about what about those stories would have stuck with someone from the Middle Ages. Why would those stories have been so popular? Would it be because it was presenting a precocious young Christ that kids and parents could grasp onto more easily? Is it because the stories are entertaining to see the way that Christ owns people with his powers? I couldn't tell you because I'm not someone from the Middle Ages. But I think for our purposes, the most valuable reason to study it is because it has provided a platform for which other people can make art examining and analyzing what the life of a young Jesus Christ must have been, such as Anne Rice's Christ the Lord out of Egypt and this movie, The Carpenter's Son. When I settled into my theater chair with my popcorn and Coke Zero and peanut butter M&Ms, I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting that much. Many horror films are bad. Most biblical films are bad. A biblical horror movie, that Venn diagram should make it extra bad, right? I was kind of prepared going in to give this the one-line review, The Last Temptation of Christ for Idiots. But early on, there were a few things that impressed me. They do the nativity in a very non-glamorous way, which immediately transitions into a short but harrowing portrayal of the massacre of the innocents. But, you know, that's just kind of the prologue that they have to get through in order to get to the story proper. I want to make it clear that the movie doesn't say Mary, Joseph, and Jesus by any means. They simply say the carpenter, his wife, and his son. I guess for plausible deniability against criticism from the evangelical crowd, but that clearly didn't work, right? But a single time towards the end of the film, at a pivotal moment, Nicolas Cage addresses his son as Yeshua, which I thought was very neat. For the folks at home, Yeshua is Christ's real name. He's named Josh. He's literally named Josh. Don't let anybody tell you that Jesus isn't named Josh. So I guess I'll refer to him as Yeshua for the rest of this endeavor. The carpenter and his wife and their baby boy escape Judea. After this short prologue, we cut to 15 years later. This is the first major change that the carpenter's son makes from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. The Infancy Gospel explicitly follows Christ as a kid, as a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old. This just starts off and says, okay, Christ is 15 years old, which I think from the jump was a very smart decision of adaptation, because a lot of the tensions from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is to say Christ misusing his powers, having a tense relationship with his parents and especially his adoptive father Joseph, really maps so much better onto a moody teenager than it does onto a 5-year-old child, right? In fact, they throw most of the Infancy Gospel out the window, but in ditching most of the fluff so that they could explicitly focus on the emotional through line of Yeshua and his relationship with his parents, I thought it was a more thematically powerful work, and ultimately the correct decision to do. Only 2 or 3 incidents from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas explicitly show up in the Carpenter's Son, but I guess ultimately makes sense for the narrative that they were telling, which is more about the uncertainty and psychological horror of it all rather than the wonder of bringing birds to life. However, towards the climax, one of the psychotic things from the Infancy Gospel does in fact happen, and at that moment, I stood up in my chair in the theater and I went, "Oh!" And it was okay because there was nobody else there. But to get back on track, the story begins with our family of 3 moving to a new town, having been in hiding from King Herod and his forces for 15 years. I was honestly kind of uncertain whether this was meant to be Nazareth or just some other vaguely Judean backwater where they are close enough to Jerusalem's political center for everyone to be more or less Jewish, but there's still worship of various pagan gods and whatnot going on. I am really curious where they shot this film because I was truly impressed by the craggy landscapes that the characters keep maneuvering over. It really did feel, to me at least, like Roman Judea, even though ultimately you could tell that this was a low budget picture. I would say that the main weakness in terms of its cinematography, which again, I was generally pretty impressed by, is a huge reliance on day for night, right? Like any of the scenes that are at night are clearly just shot during the day and they put a blue filter over it. I guess I'll give it the benefit of the doubt, considering that this was probably a pretty low budget production. The family gets situated, Joseph taking on the role as a local carpenter, and Yeshua goes to school for the first time. They have neighbors, including a mute girl named Lilith. I have to be real, her being named Lilith made me roll my eyes harder than the wheels of Dominic Toretto's car. And surprise, surprise, Lilith gets possessed later. But when Yeshua goes to school for the first time, he befriends this BPD girly who, spoilers, is literally Satan. And thus the pieces for our drama are set up. Mary and Joseph love their son. They know he is the Son of God, but they are overprotective. They are keeping him in the dark about his true nature. Meanwhile, Yeshua is having this very chaotic and difficult adolescence. He is constantly racked by nightmares of his inevitable crucifixion. He understands that something is off with him, but he doesn't quite know what. He keeps doing these preternatural things and he doesn't know what to make with them. Meanwhile, this girl he befriends, who again is literally Satan, is the only person who is there for him, saying like, hey, I know what's up with you, I can help you, etc., etc. Her influence drives a wedge between him and his parents, and the core drama is he going to align himself with this deeply suspicious girl, or is he going to align himself with his parents, who are clearly lying to him about something or other, but he doesn't know what? Yeshua is played by Noah Jupe, who I don't really know, but he seems to be a young and upcoming actor, and I thought he did a pretty convincing job of portraying a realistically moody, hormonal, teenaged Christ who doesn't quite know what's going on. He is the protagonist of the story. The girl who plays Satan is this young actress named Isla Johnstone, I believe, and I thought she was absolutely incredible. Normally, when people are asked to play Satan, they don't go subtle about it, right? They go full Al Pacino. They start screaming and twirling their mustache and all that. But this portrayal of Satan was as someone who is simultaneously a friend and adversary to Yeshua, right? A genuine tempter who is offering the fruit of knowledge in exchange for some dark and devious ends. And trust me, there is so much snake imagery, maybe too much snake imagery, to drive the point home. I especially thought towards the end where the film could be more open about what her deal is. They did a fantastic job of making Satan this tormented, pathetic character, right? Very Miltonian, very Paradise Lost. Even though what I mostly appreciate about the film is how relatively realistic and accurate it was to first century Judea, I understand the impulse in the need to later interpretations of Satan in order to make this character more nuanced. I would say Mary, as played by the actress formerly known as Twigs, is the real weak link of the film. I don't know how much of it is her fault necessarily. I do think that Mary is relatively underwritten in the script, which is a real disappointment considering how complex Joseph, Yeshua, and Satan are. But at the same time, with the material that she is given, I think the actress formerly known as Twigs could have done way more with it. And instead, she mostly just looks beatific. Let's put it this way. She is good at looking like Mary. Every time they cut to her, she's just looking soulful and sweet. She is really good at looking like an icon of the Virgin Mary, but not that great at delivering emotionally compelling lines. Now, the only one of the main four characters I have to talk about is the big man himself, Nicolas Cage. Even though the carpenter's son, Yeshua, is the protagonist of this story, Nicolas Cage is undoubtedly the star. I think the way he is written is what made this such a compelling film for me, in portraying his difficult relationship with his adopted son, who may or may not be a bastard. He doesn't even know, ? This is a man who received a vision telling him that his wife's pregnancy was not a result of adultery 15 years earlier, but who has received radio silence from God ever since. He is a man who is really faithful to his God through the precepts of Mosaic law, but that very Mosaic law is constantly brushing up against the new form of faith that his son represents. He is a hard-nosed, controlling dad. He is constantly trying to drill the mitzvot, the 613 commands from the Torah, into his son. These are the foods that are unclean. These are the times of day to bathe, so on and so forth. He is someone of genuine Jewish faith, which I think is often lacking in most of these biblical movies, where every character ascribes to anachronistic, obviously Protestant theology. And so, because Nicolas Cage is so faithfully Jewish, Why wouldn't he be deeply disturbed when his son starts doing weird stuff? The Torah makes explicit instructions to kill all wizards, right? To kill all people who do magic or miracles. So Nicolas Cage is always baffled, like, why is my son touching lepers and making himself unclean willingly? The tense relationship between father and son, between Yeshua and Joseph, is easily the strongest thing about this film. And I think it reveals that this isn't really a horror film at all. It's really a coming of age family drama with horror elements. It's so funny how almost everyone in the film does the standard biblical received pronunciation accent, oh, my son, I love you so much, I would do anything for you. Nicolas Cage just does the Nicolas Cage voice, and he's like, I think my son is possessed by a demon. I know not whether his powers come from God above or from forces below. Don't worry, Nicolas Cage fans. He gets some really great freakout moments towards the end, which again had me cheering and laughing. I feel like I'm going long, so I'm just going to wrap things up. If you go into The Carpenter's Son expecting a conventional horror movie, I think you will be disappointed. However, I ultimately ended up loving it because it far exceeded my expectations as a dual family and theological drama that just happens to have horror elements. It reminded me a lot of The Witch by Robert Eggers in that way. Another movie that it reminded me of a lot was Darren Aronofsky's Noah, another movie that draws from the Apocrypha in order to present a biblical narrative that feels far more authentic to the Bible as understood by the writers of the time rather than the hyper sanitized narratives that we get today. I really respected The Carpenter's Son for asking some very potent theological questions that nevertheless remain true to the religious practices and theological understandings of first century Judea, which I have to emphasize is very different to the Christianity and Judaism that is practiced by modern day believers. I think most people who make Bible movies assume that the Bible is this immortal, unchanging document and that modern interpretations of the text are the correct ones. And that's why it makes me see so much red when I see all these evangelicals say, like, this is satanic. This is based off of extra biblical sources that the devil is digging up in order to trick you away from Christ. Even though the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is not used today, it was used and was beloved for hundreds upon hundreds of years. We read it today and we're weirded out, rightly so, frankly, of this murderous Christ child. But just because it contradicts your understanding of Jesus Christ doesn't mean that it's wrong or evil. It just means that the people who wrote it and the people who read it had a different perspective on your religion than you do. And that is okay. It is okay for people to have different perspectives on your religion. It bothers me that mainstream Christians will just dismiss all of these alternative texts, these alternative gospels out of hand and say, well, that's not in our current Bible, so it must be bad and evil. These texts were literally written by early Christians who bled and died for their religion, who actually got martyred, who actually got crucified and thrown to lions and whatnot for what they believe. And just because what they believe isn't what you believe today doesn't mean that their death didn't mean something. The early Christians who wrote these texts are quite literally better Christians than you are or will ever be. To paraphrase Yeshua ben Yosef, aka Jesus the Christ, woe unto ye fucking hypocrites. Despite the insistence of the religious right that all movies about Christianity or other religious topics have to be safe and homogenous, I am really glad that we have filmmakers like Lofty Nathan, like Darren Aronofsky, like Martin Scorsese, like Pier Pasolini, like, oh, who's the guy who did Day? Carl Dreyer, like dozens and dozens of other artists, writers, filmmakers who are willing to ignore what is safe in the name of making good art. I want to reemphasize The Carpenter's Son does have its problems. It is far from a perfect film, but I am glad that it exists because religions can only grow and evolve if they are challenged, both from the inside and from the outside. Whenever the religious right has cultural dominance in the United States, which it has had many times throughout the last 200 years, including now, human culture suffers under its stifling grip. So if you're on the fence about seeing this movie, and judging by my theatrical experience, I don't think it's going to last in theaters for very long. At the very least, give it a shot. Let Jesus be Jesus. Let Nicolas Cage be Nicolas Cage. Thanks. I love you.